The guns and troops on the Silo heights, though mercilessly bombed and shelled, had doggedly persisted and pinned the enemy down. Despite Buss's men stopping the Russians nearly everywhere, it came at a terrible cost. In some areas, officers reported being outnumbered at least 10-1. "They come at us in hordes, in wave after wave, without regard to loss of life," one division commander had telephoned. "We fire our machine guns, often at point-blank range, until they turn red hot. My men are fighting until they run out of ammunition. Then they are simply wiped out or completely overrun. How long this can continue, I don't know." Nearly every message was alike, with frantic calls for reinforcements. Guns, tanks, and above all, ammunition and gasoline were needed. One item was irreplaceable: troops. Buss's few reserves were either already committed or moving up, most of them hurriedly thrown into battle in the crucial Silo region. Holding this central area of the Ninth Army was the 56th Panzer Corps. It bore a famous name, but that was about all. The 56th had been shattered and reconstituted many times. Now, once more, it was undergoing a rebuilding process. About all that remained of the original corps was a group of key staff members. But despite all, the corps had one definite asset: a highly experienced, much-decorated commander, Lieutenant General Karl Weidling, a rough-spoken officer known to his friends as Smasher Karl. Buss had placed the miscellaneous units in the vital Silo region under Weidling's command. At the moment, Weidling had 3 divisions: Göring's skittish and unreliable 9th Parachute, the badly mauled 20th Panzer Grenadiers, and the understrength Müncheberg Division. Supported by a corps on either side, the 101st on the left and the 11th SS on the right, Weidling's 56th Corps was opposing the Russians' main thrust on Berlin. Although Weidling had arrived only a few days before and was fighting in unfamiliar terrain with weak and often inexperienced forces, the 60-year-old veteran had so far repulsed all attacks. But he badly needed the remainder of his units, and as yet, on this April 16th morning, they had not arrived. Weidling's problems were only beginning. Before the week was out, he would be facing crises far greater than any he had ever encountered on a battlefield. Smasher Karl was shortly destined to be condemned to death, both by Busse and Hitler, and then, in a strange quirk of fate, in Germany's last hours, he would become the defender of Berlin. On the Western Front, General Walter Wenck, commander of the 12th Army, was both pleased and puzzled. The success of his young and inexperienced units in throwing back the enemy and wiping out their bridgehead south of Magdeburg was a greater achievement than Wenck had dared hope for. The bridgehead at Barbie, however, was a different story. Wenck's men had tried everything they could think of to destroy the Barbie bridges, from floating mines down the river to using frogmen. Some of the last remaining Luftwaffe planes in the area had also made a bombing attack. That, too, had failed. The bridgehead was well established by now, and American troops and armour had been pouring across the river for more than 48 hours. What puzzled Wenck was that although the Americans were strengthening and consolidating their hold on the Elbe's eastern bank, they were making no effort whatever to drive toward Berlin. Wenck could not understand it. The furious assault by the Americans between April 12th and 15 had given Wenck every reason to believe he would be forced to fight a bloody defensive battle in the West. Yet now the Americans gave every appearance of having come to a halt. "Frankly, I'm astonished," Wenck told Colonel Reichelm, his chief of staff. "Maybe they've outrun their supplies and need to reorganize." Whatever the reason, Wenck was glad of the respite. His forces were widely scattered, and in many places still being organized. He needed all the time he could get to whip his army into shape and to reinforce his troops with whatever armour he could lay his hands on. Some tanks and self-propelled guns had arrived, but Wenck had little hope of getting more, nor did he have any illusions that he would receive the full complement of divisions he had been promised. Wenck suspected that there was simply nothing left to send him. One thing was certain: the 12th Army, spread thinly along the Elbe before Berlin, could not hold any sort of onslaught for long. "If the Americans launch a major attack, they'll crack our positions with ease," he told Reichelm. "After that, what's to stop them? There's nothing between here and Berlin." The news was like a blow to Karl Weiberg. He stared incredulously at his boss, Hennings Jessen Schmidt, the head of the OSS Berlin unit. "Are you sure?" Weiberg asked. "Are you quite sure?" Jessen Schmidt nodded. "That's the information I've received," he said, "and I've no reason to doubt it." The two men looked at each other in silence. For months they had been sustained by the conviction that Eisenhower's forces would capture Berlin. But the news that had brought Jessen Schmidt across town to Weiberg's apartment had dashed all their hopes. A network courier had just arrived from Sweden with a message of prime importance from London. It warned them not to expect the Anglo-Americans. In all the long months that he had led his double life in Berlin, Weiberg had considered almost every possibility but this. Even now he could not quite believe it. The change in plan would not affect their jobs, at least for the time being. They were to continue sending out information, and Weiberg, in his role as storekeeper, would still distribute supplies to operatives when and if the order came. But as far as Weiberg knew, few, if any, of the trained specialists and saboteurs who were supposed to use the equipment had arrived in the city. Jessen Schmidt had been waiting for weeks for just one man, a radio technician who was to assemble the transmitter and receiver that still lay hidden beneath a pile of coal in Weiberg's cellar. With sinking heart, Weiberg wondered if anybody would come now, or if the equipment could ever be put to use. That cache of supplies was dangerous. The Germans might yet find it. Worse, the Russians might. Weiberg hoped London had told the Eastern Allies about the little group of spies in Berlin. If not, the large store of military material was going to be difficult to explain. Weiberg also had a personal reason to be anxious. After his long years as a widower, he had recently met a young woman named Inga Müller. They planned to marry when the war ended. Now Weiberg wondered how safe Inga would be if the Russians arrived. It seemed to him that the little group of conspirators was doomed in the fiery cauldron that Berlin would soon become. He tried to put aside his fears, but he had never felt such dejection. They had been abandoned. The commander of the 1st Guards Tank Army, Colonel General Mikhail Katukov, slammed down the field phone and, whirling around, violently kicked the door of his headquarters. He had just received a report from the officer leading the 65th Guards Tank Brigade on the Silo Heights front. The Russians were getting nowhere. "We are standing on the heels of the infantry," General Ivan Yushchuk had told Katukov. "We are stuck on our noses." His anger somewhat appeased, Katukov turned from the door to face his staff. Hands on his hips, he shook his head in disbelief. "Those Hitlerite devils," he said. "I have never seen such resistance in the whole course of the war." Then Katukov announced that he was going to find out for himself what the hell is holding things up. No matter what, he must take the heights by morning so Zhukov's breakout could begin. To the south, Marshal Koniev's forces had smashed through the German defences on an 18-mile front west of the Neisse. His troops were pouring across the river. They now had in operation 20 tank-carrying bridges, some capable of supporting 60 tons, 21 ferry and troop crossing sites, and 17 light assault bridges. With Stormovik dive bombers blasting a path, Koniev's tankers had driven more than 10 miles through the enemy defences in less than 8 hours of battle. Now Koniev was just 21 miles from Lublin, the point at which Stalin had terminated the boundary between his forces and Zhukov's. There, Koniev's tankers would veer northwest and head for the main road leading through Zossen and into Berlin. On the maps, this route was labelled Reichsstrasse 96, the highway that Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had called Der Weg zur Ewigkeit, the road to eternity. It almost seemed as if the authorities were not prepared to face the fact that Berlin was endangered. Although the Red Army was now barely 32 miles away, no alarm had been given and no official announcement had been made. Berliners knew very well that the Russians had attacked. The muffled thunder of artillery had been the first clue. Now, from refugees, by telephone and by word of mouth, the news had spread. But it was still fragmentary and contradictory, and in the absence of any real information, there was wild speculation and rumour. Some people said the Russians were fewer than 10 miles away. while others heard that they were already in the eastern suburbs. No one knew precisely what the situation was, but most Berliners now believed that the city's days were numbered, that its death throes had begun. And yet, astonishingly, people still went about their business. They were nervous, and it was increasingly difficult to preserve the outward appearance of normality, but everyone tried. At every stop, milkman Richard Pogonovska was besieged with questions. His customers seemed to expect him to know more than anyone else. The usually cheerful Pogonovska could not provide any answers. He was as fearful as those he served. On the Kreuznacher Strasse, the portrait of Adolf Hitler still hung in the living room of the Nazi postal official, but even that no longer seemed reassuring to Pogonovska. He was happy to see his young friend, 13-year-old Dodo Marquardt, waiting patiently for him on a corner in Friedenau. She often rode with him for a block or two, and she helped immeasurably to keep up his morale. Now, sitting next to his dog Poldy, Dodo chattered happily. But Pogonovska found it difficult to listen to her this morning. Some newly painted slogans had appeared on the half-demolished walls in the area, and he eyed them without enthusiasm. "Berlin will remain German," one announced. Others read, "Victory or slavery. Vienna will be German again," and "Who believes in Hitler believes in victory." At Dodo's usual stop, Pogonovska lifted her down from the wagon. With a little smile, she said, "Until tomorrow, Mr. Milkman." Pogonovska replied, "Until tomorrow, Dodo." As he climbed back on the wagon, Richard Pogonovska wondered just how many tomorrows there were left. Pastor Arthur Lechscheit, presiding over a burial service in the cemetery near his wrecked church, did not think the suffering that lay ahead could be any worse than it was right now. It seemed an eternity since his beautiful Melanchthon church had been destroyed. During the past few weeks, so many had been killed in the raids that his parish clerk no longer registered the deaths. Lechscheit stood at the edge of a mass grave in which lay the bodies of 40 victims killed during the night's air raids. Only a few persons were present as he said the funeral service. As he finished, most of them moved away, but one young girl remained behind. She told Lechscheit that her brother was one of the dead. Then, tearfully, she said, "He belonged to the SS. He was not a member of the church." She hesitated. "Will you pray for him?" she asked. Lechscheit nodded. Much as he disagreed with the Nazis and the SS, in death, he told her, he could deny no man the words of God. Bowing his head, he said, "Lord, do not hide your face from me. My days have gone like a shadow. My life is like nothing before you. My time lies in your hands." On a wall nearby, during the night, somebody had scrawled the words, "Germany is victorious." Mother Superior Cunegundes longed for the end of it all. Even though Haus Dahlem, the convent and maternity home run by the Mission Sisters of the Sacred Heart in Wilmersdorf, was almost a little island in its religious seclusion, the short, round, energetic Mother Superior was not without outside sources of information. The Dahlem Press Club, in the villa of Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, directly across from the convent, had closed down the night before. From newspaper friends who had come to say goodbye, she had heard that the end was near and that the battle for the city would take place within a few days. The resolute Mother Superior hoped the fighting would not be prolonged. What with an Allied plane crashing in her orchard and the roof of her convent being blown off a few days before, the danger was coming much too close. It was long past time for this foolish and terrible war to end. In the meantime, she had more than 200 people to care for, 107 newborn babies, of whom 91 were illegitimate, 32 mothers and 60 nuns and lay sisters. As though the sisters did not have enough to do, Mother Superior had piled even more work upon them. With the janitor's help, some of the nuns had painted huge white circles surmounted by bright red crosses on the sides of the building and on the new tar paper roof which covered the entire second floor. The third floor had disappeared with the roof. Realist that she was, Mother Superior had set her student nurses to converting the dining hall and recreation rooms into first aid stations. The nurses' dining hall had become the chapel, illuminated by candles night and day. The basement was now partitioned into nurseries and a series of smaller rooms for confinement cases. Mother Superior had even seen to it that all windows in this area were cemented, bricked up, and sandbagged from the outside. She was as ready for what might come as she would ever be. But there was one thing she simply did not know how to prepare for. She shared the anxiety of their confessor and mentor, Father Bernhard Happich, that the women might be molested by the occupying forces. Father Happich had arranged to speak to the sisters about this matter on April 23rd. Now, in light of the news her journalist friends had brought, Mother Superior Kunigundes hoped they hadn't waited too long. It looked to her as if the Russians might arrive at any time. As people waited for news, they hid their anxiety in grim humour. A new greeting swept the city. Total strangers shook hands and urged each other, "Bleib übrig," survive. Many Berliners were burlesquing Goebbels' broadcast of 10 days before. Insisting that Germany's fortune would undergo a sudden change, he had said, "The Führer knows the exact hour of its arrival. Destiny has sent us this man so that we, in this time of great external and internal stress, shall testify to the miracle." Now those words were being repeated everywhere, usually in a derisive imitation of the propaganda minister's spellbinding style. One other saying was going the rounds. "We've got nothing at all to worry about," people solemnly assured one another. "Grofaz will save us." Grofaz had long been the Berliners' nickname for Hitler. It was the abbreviation of Größter Feldherr aller Zeiten, the greatest general of all time. Even with the city almost under the Russian guns, the vast majority of Berlin's industrial concerns were still producing. Shells and ammunition were being rushed to the front as fast as factories in Spandau could make them. Electrical equipment was being turned out at the Siemens plant in Siemensstadt. Vast quantities of ball bearings and machine tools were being made in factories at Marienfelde, Weissensee, and Erkner. Gun barrels and mounts rolled out of the Rheinmetall Borsig factory at Tegel. Tanks, lorries, and self-propelled guns rumbled off the assembly lines at Alkit in Ruhleben. And as fast as tanks were repaired at the Krupp und Druckenmüller plant in Tempelhof, workers delivered them directly to the armies. So great was the urgency that the management had even asked foreign workers to volunteer as emergency drivers. French forced labourer Jacques Delaunay was one who flatly refused. "You were very wise," a tank driver who returned to the plant that afternoon told Delaunay. "Do you know where we took those tanks? Right up to the front lines." Not only industrial plants, but services and utilities continued to function. At the main meteorological station in Potsdam, weathermen noted routinely that the noontime temperature was 65 degrees with an expected drop to about 40 by nightfall. The sky was clear with occasional scattered clouds, and there was a mild southwest wind which would swing southeast by evening. A change was predicted for the 17th, overcast skies with the possibility of thunder showers. Partly because of the fine weather, streets were crowded. Housewives, not knowing what the future might hold, shopped for unrationed commodities wherever they could. Every shop seemed to have its own long queue. In Köpenick, Robert and Hannah Schulze spent 3 hours in a line for bread. Who knew when they would be able to buy more? Like thousands of other Berliners, the Schulzes had tried to find some way to forget their worries. On this day, braving the now capricious transportation system, they changed buses and trams 6 times to get to their Charlottenburg destination, a movie theatre. It was their 3rd such venture in a week. In various districts, they had seen pictures called Ein Mann wie Maximilian, a man like Maximilian, Engel mit dem Seitenspiel, angel with a lyre, and Die große Nummer, the big number. Die große Nummer was a circus picture, and Robert thought it the best of the week's film fare by far. French POW Raymond Legatier saw that there was so much confusion at the military headquarters on Bendlerstrasse that his presence would not be missed, and he calmly took the afternoon off. These days the guards did not seem to care anyway. Legatier had managed to wrangle a ticket for a movie theatre near the Potsdamer Platz that was reserved for German soldiers. Now he relaxed in the darkness as the picture, specially reissued by Goebbels' propaganda ministry, came on. It was a historical full-colour epic called Kohlberg, and it dealt with Graf von Gneisenau's heroic defence of the Pomeranian city during the Napoleonic Wars. During the movie, Legatier was as fascinated by the behaviour of the soldiers around him as he was by the picture. They were enthralled, cheering, clapping, exclaiming to one another. They were almost transported by this saga of one of Germany's legendary military figures. It occurred to Legatier that before too long, some of these soldiers might get a chance to become heroes themselves. The signal came without warning. In his office in the Philharmonic, the complex of buildings that housed the concert halls and practice studios of the Berlin Philharmonic, Dr. Gerhard von Westermann, the orchestra's manager, received a message from Reichsminister Albert Speer. The Philharmonic would play its last concert that evening. Von Westermann had always known that the news would come like this, suddenly and within just a few hours of a concert. Speer's instructions were that all the musicians who would leave were to do so immediately after the performance. They were to end their journey in the Kulmbach-Bayreuth region, about 240 miles southwest of Berlin, the same area to which Speer had earlier sent most of the Philharmonic's prized instruments. According to the Reichsminister, the Americans would overrun the Bayreuth area in a matter of hours. There was just one trouble. Speer's original design had been to spirit away the entire Philharmonic. This plan had collapsed. To begin with, fearing that the plan might reach Goebbels's ear, von Westermann had sounded out only certain trusted members of the orchestra. To his amazement, the great majority, because of family, sentimental, or other ties with the city, were reluctant to leave. When the plan was put to a vote, it was turned down. Gerhard Taschner, the young violin virtuoso and concertmaster, was asked to inform Speer. The Reichsminister had taken the news philosophically, but the offer was left open. Speer's own car and driver would be waiting on the final night to take those who wanted to go. Taschner, his wife and 2 children, along with the daughter of fellow musician Georg Dieberts, were definitely leaving. But they were the only ones. Even von Westermann, in view of the vote, felt that he must stay. But if there were any wavering Philharmonic members, they would have to be told that this was their last chance. There was still a possibility that those who were in on the secret might change their minds and decide to leave. So, with the evening's performance barely 3 hours away, von Westermann revised the programme. It was too late even to schedule a rehearsal, and the musicians who knew nothing of the evacuation plan would be startled by the change. But for the knowing and unknowing alike, the music Speer had picked as the signal marking the last concert would have a dark and moving significance. The scores that von Westermann now ordered placed on the musicians' stands bore the label Die Götterdämmerung, Wagner's climactic and tragic music of the death of the gods. By now it was fast becoming clear to all Berliners that Fortress Berlin was a myth. Even the least knowledgeable could see how ill-prepared the city was to withstand an attack. The main roads and highways were still open. There were few guns or armoured vehicles in evidence, and apart from aged Home Guardsmen, some in uniform, others with only armbands sewn on the sleeves of their jackets, there were virtually no troops to be seen. To be sure, there were roadblocks and crude defence barriers everywhere. In side streets, courtyards, around government buildings and in parks, large stockpiles of fortification materials had been collected. There were occasional rolls of barbed wire, masses of steel anti-tank obstacles, and old trucks and disused tramcars filled with stones. These were to be used to block main thoroughfares when the city came under attack. But would barricades such as these stop the Russians? It will take the Reds at least 2 hours and 15 minutes to break through, a current joke went. 2 hours laughing their heads off and 15 minutes smashing the barricades. Defence lines, trenches, anti-tank ditches, barricades and gun positions were apparent only on the outskirts, and even these, as Berliners could plainly see, were far from completion. One man, driving out of the city this day, found the defence preparations utterly futile, ridiculous. He was an expert on fortifications. General Max Pemsel had been the Chief of Staff of the 7th Army defending Normandy on D-Day. Because his forces had failed to stop the invasion, Pemsel, along with others, had been in disgrace with Hitler ever since. He had been put in command of an obscure division fighting in the north and had resigned himself to this dead command. Then, on April 2nd, a surprised Pemsel had received instructions from General Jodl to fly to Berlin. Bad weather had delayed his planes everywhere, and he had not reached the capital until April 12th. Jodl had admonished him for his tardiness. "You know, Pemsel," he said, "you were supposed to be appointed commander of Berlin, but you've arrived too late." As he heard these words, Pemsel said later, "A large stone fell off my heart." Now, instead of taking over the Berlin command, Pemsel was en route to the Italian front. Jodl had appointed him chief of staff to Marshal Rodolfo Graziani's Italian army. Pemsel found the situation almost dreamlike. He considered it doubtful that Graziani's force still existed. Nevertheless, Jodl had briefed him on his duties as thoroughly as though the war were proving a brilliant success and were destined to go on for years. "Your job," he cautioned Pemsel, "will be very difficult because it demands not only great military knowledge but diplomatic skills." Unrealistic as Jodl's outlook was, Pemsel was pleased to be going to Italy. On the way, he would pass through Bavaria, and for the first time in 2 years he would see his wife and family. By the time he reached Italy, perhaps the war would be over. As Pemsel left Berlin, he felt that fate and the weather had been exceptionally kind to him. It was clear that the city could not be defended. Passing a hodgepodge of tree trunks, steel spikes, and cone-shaped concrete blocks that would be used as anti-tank obstacles, he shook his head in disbelief. Still farther along, the car sped by elderly home guardsmen slowly digging trenches. As he left the city behind, Pemsel later recounted, "I thanked God for allowing this bitter chalice to pass from me." At his headquarters on the Hohenzollern-Damm, the city's commandant, General Rehmann, stood before a huge wall map of Berlin, looking at the defence lines marked on it, and wondering, as he afterward put it, what in God's name I was supposed to do. Rehmann had hardly slept for the past 3 days and was bone-weary. Since morning he had taken countless telephone calls, attended several meetings, visited sections of the perimeter defence lines, and issued a batch of orders, most of which, he privately believed, stood little chance of being completed before the Russians reached the city. Earlier in the day, Goebbels, Berlin's Gauleiter and self-appointed defender, had held his usual weekly war council. To Rehmann, these meetings seemed almost farcical now. In the afternoon, he described this latest one to his chief of staff, Colonel Refior. "He told me the same old thing. He said, 'If the battle for Berlin was on right now, you would have at your disposal all sorts of tanks and field pieces of different calibers, several thousand light and heavy machine guns, and several hundred mortars, in addition to large quantities of corresponding ammunition.'" Rehmann paused. "According to Goebbels," he told Refior, "we'll get everything we want, if Berlin is encircled." Then Goebbels had suddenly switched the conversation. "Once the battle for Berlin begins, where do you intend to set up your headquarters?" he had asked. Goebbels himself planned to go to the Zoo bunker. He suggested that Rehmann operate from there also. Rehmann thought he saw immediately what the Gauleiter had in mind. Goebbels intended to keep Rehmann and the defence of Berlin completely under his own thumb. As tactfully as he could, Rehmann had sidestepped the offer. "I would like to refrain from that," he said, "since both the military and political could be eliminated at the same time by a freakish hit." Goebbels had dropped the subject, but Rehmann noticed an immediate coolness in the Gauleiter's manner. Goebbels was well aware that it would be almost impossible for the massive Zoo bunker to be destroyed by even a score of large bombs. Rehmann knew the Reichsminister would not forget that his invitation had been turned down. But at the moment, while he was faced with the almost hopeless task of trying to prepare a defence for the city, the last person Rehmann wanted in close proximity was Goebbels. He placed no stock in either the Gauleiter's pronouncements or in his promises. Only a few days earlier, again discussing supplies, Goebbels had said that the Berlin defence would be bolstered with at least 100 tanks. Rehman had asked for a written list of the promised supplies. When he finally got the information, the 100 tanks turned out to be 25 tanks completed, 75 now being built. No matter how many there were, Rehman knew he would see no part of any of them. The Oder front would have priority on all such vital weapons. In Rehman's view, only one cabinet member really understood what lay ahead for Berlin. That was Reichsminister Albert Speer, and even he had his blind spot. Immediately after the Gauleiter's War Council, Rehman had been ordered to present himself before Speer. At the former French embassy on the Pariser Platz, where Hitler's wartime production chief now had his offices, the usually urbane Speer was furious. Pointing to the great highway running across a map of the city, Speer demanded to know what Rehman was up to on the east-west axis. Rehman looked at him in amazement. "I'm building a landing strip between the Brandenburg Gate and the Victory Column," he answered. "Why? Why?" exploded Speer. "Why? You are chopping down my lampposts, that's why, and you cannot do it." Rehman had thought Speer knew all about the plan. In the battles for Breslau and Königsberg, the Russians had grabbed the airports on the outskirts of both cities almost immediately. To circumvent a similar situation in Berlin, should one occur, it had been decided to build a landing strip almost in the very centre of the government district, along the east-west axis where it passed through the Tiergarten. For this reason, Rehman said later, in agreement with the Luftwaffe, the strip between the Brandenburg Gate and the Victory Column was chosen. It meant that the ornamental bronze lamp posts would have to be removed, and the trees, for a depth of 30 metres, about 100 feet on either side, would have to come down. When I mentioned this plan to Hitler, he said that the lamp posts could go, but the trees had to remain. I did my utmost to persuade him to change his mind, but Hitler would not hear of the trees being cut. Even though I explained that if the trees were not taken out, only small planes would be able to take off and land, he still would not change his mind. What his reasons were, I do not know, but the removal of a few trees would hardly have ruined the city's beauty at this late date. And now Speer was objecting to the removal of the lampposts. Rehman explained the situation to Speer, pointing out in conclusion that he had the Führer's permission to remove the posts, but that made no impression on the Reichsminister. "You cannot take down those lampposts," he insisted. "I object to that." Then Speer added, "You do not seem to realize that I am responsible for the reconstruction of Berlin." In vain, Rehman tried to persuade Speer to change his mind. "It is vital that we keep an airstrip open, especially in this location," he argued. The Reichsminister would hear no more. As Rehman remembered it, the conversation ended with Speer expressing his intention of taking up the whole matter with the Führer. Meanwhile, his lampposts remained, and the work on the strip was to stop, even though the Russians were advancing steadily toward us. Just before the meeting ended, Speer brought up the matter of Berlin's bridges. Again he argued with Rehman, as he had at Heinrich's headquarters the day before, that to destroy the bridges was futile, that water, power and gas mains were carried over many of them, and that the severing of these lifelines would paralyze large parts of the city and make my task of reconstruction that much more difficult. Rehman knew that Speer's influence with Hitler was great. He had already received a direct order from the Reichskanzlei to strike off his list several of those bridges slated for destruction. Now Speer was insisting that they all be saved. Rehman turned as stubborn as Speer. Unless counter-orders were received from Hitler, Rehman intended to carry out his instructions and blow up the remaining bridges. He did not like the idea any more than Speer, but he had no intention of risking his own life and career to save them. From Speer's office, Rehman made a quick visit to one of the defence sectors on Berlin's outskirts. Each of these inspections only served to deepen Rehman's conviction that Berlin's defences were an illusion. In the strutting, triumphant years, the Nazis had never considered the possibility that one day a last stand would be made in the capital. They had built fortifications everywhere else, the Gustav Line in Italy, the Atlantic Wall along the European coast, the Siegfried Line at Germany's western borders, But not even a trench had been built around Berlin. Not even when the Russians drove with titanic force across Eastern Europe and invaded the fatherland did Hitler and his military advisers act to fortify the city. It was only when the Red Army reached the Oder early in 1945 that the Germans began to strengthen Berlin's defences. Slowly a few trenches and anti-tank obstacles appeared on the eastern outskirts of the city. Then, incredibly, when the Red Army pulled up before the frozen river to wait for the spring thaws, the preparations for the capital's protection stopped too. Not until March was the defence of Berlin given any serious consideration, and by then it was too late. There were no longer the forces, the supplies, or the equipment to set up the necessary fortifications. In 2 gruelling months of frenetic activity, a makeshift series of defence lines had been thrown together. Sometime in late February, an obstacle belt had been hurriedly established in a broken ring 20 to 30 miles outside the capital. This line ran through wooded areas and marshes and along lakes, rivers and canals, mostly north, south and east of the city. Before Rehmann took command, orders had been issued declaring the obstacle areas fortified places. In keeping with Hitler's fortress mania, local Home Guard contingents were told that they would be expected to stand fast at these locations and fight to the last man. To turn such localities into a solid zone of resistance, staggering quantities of men, guns and materials would have been needed, for the obstacle belt girdled nearly 150 miles of territory around Greater Berlin. As Rehmann soon discovered, except where the obstacle zone came under direct army supervision, the so-called fortified places were often nothing more than a few trenches covering main roads, some scattered gun positions, or a few concrete reinforced structures hurriedly converted into blockhouses with bricked-up windows and slits for machine guns. These feeble positions, most of them not even manned, were marked on Reichskanzlei defence maps as major strongpoints. The main line of resistance lay in the city itself. 3 concentric rings made up the inner defence pattern. The first, 60 miles in circumference, ran around the outskirts. In the absence of proper fortifications, everything and anything had been used to create barriers. Ancient railroad cars and wagons, ruined buildings, massive concrete block walls, converted air raid bunkers, and, nature's contribution, Berlin's lakes and rivers. Now, gangs of men were working night and day to tie these natural and man-made devices into a continuous defence line and anti-tank barrier. The work was being done by hand. There was no power equipment. Most heavy earth-moving machines had long since been sent east to work on the Oder front fortifications. The use of the few remaining machines was restricted because of the shortage of fuel. Every available gallon had gone to the panzer divisions. There were supposed to be 100,000 labourers working on the fortification rings. In fact, there were never more than 30,000. There was even a shortage of hand tools. Appeals through the newspapers for picks and shovels had brought little results. As Colonel Refior put it, Berlin gardeners apparently consider the digging of their potato plots more important than the digging of tank traps. To Rehmann, it was all futile anyhow. The perimeter ring would never be finished in time. It was a hopeless job, hopelessly far from completion. The second or middle ring could be a formidable obstacle if manned by veteran troops amply supplied with weapons. It had a circumference of about 25 miles, and its barriers had long been in place. The Berlin railway system had been converted into a deadly trap. In some places there were deep track cuttings and sidings, some of them 100 to 200 yards wide, which made perfect anti-tank ditches. From fortified houses overlooking the tracks, gunners could pick off tanks caught in the gullies. Along other stretches, the line followed the elevated railway, S-Bahn, giving defenders the advantage of high rampart-like embankments. If even these defences gave way, there still remained the third or inner ring in the city's centre. Called the Citadel, this last-ditch area lay within the arms of the Landwehr Canal and the Spree River in the Mitte district. Nearly all the major buildings of the government crowded this last island of defence. In great structures linked together by barricades and concrete block walls, the last defenders would hold out, in Goering's immense air ministry, Reichsluftfahrtministerium, in the huge Bendler Block military headquarters, and in the empty, echoing hulks of the Reichskanzlei and the Reichstag. Radiating out from the citadel through all three of the defence rings were 8 pie-shaped sectors, each with its own commander. Beginning with the Weissensee district on the east, the sectors were labelled clockwise from A through H. The inner ring itself was Z. Supporting the rings, 6 formidable bomb-proof flak towers were spotted about the city, at Humboldthain, Friedrichshain, and in the grounds of the Berlin Zoo. But many vital links were missing in Festung Berlin. The most crucial one was manpower. Even under ideal conditions, Rehmann believed, 200,000 fully trained and combat-seasoned soldiers would have been needed to defend the city. Instead, what he had to hold Berlin's 321 square miles, an area almost equal to that of New York City, was a miscellaneous collection of troops ranging from 15-year-old Hitler youths to men in their 70s. He had policemen, engineering units, and flak battery crews, but his only infantry consisted of 60,000 untrained Home Guardsmen. These tired old men of the Volkssturm, now digging trenches or moving slowly into positions along the approaches to Berlin, would have to assume the largest burden of the city's defence. The Volkssturm occupied a kind of netherworld among the military. Although they were expected to fight alongside the Wehrmacht in times of emergency, they were not considered part of the army. They, like the Hitler Youth, were the responsibility of the local party officials. Rehmann would not even assume command of their forces until after the battle began. Even the Volkssturm equipment was the responsibility of the party. The Home Guardsmen had no vehicles, field kitchens, or communications of their own. In all, 1/3 of Rehmann's men were unarmed. The remainder might as well have been. Their weapons, he was to relate, came from every country that Germany had fought with or against. Besides our own issues, there were Italian, Russian, French, Czechoslovakian, Belgian, Dutch, Norwegian, and English guns. There were no less than 15 different types of rifles and 10 kinds of machine guns. Finding ammunition for this hodgepodge of arms was almost hopeless. Battalions equipped with Italian rifles were luckier than most. There was a maximum of 20 bullets apiece for them. Belgian guns, it was discovered, would accept a certain type of Czech bullet, but Belgian ammunition was useless in Czech rifles. There were few Greek arms, but for some reason there were vast quantities of Greek munitions. So desperate was the shortage that a way was found to remachine Greek bullets so that they could be fired in Italian rifles. But such frantic improvisations hardly alleviated the overall problem. On this opening day of the Russian attack, the average ammunition supply of each Home Guardsman was about 5 rounds per rifle. Now, as Rehmann toured positions along the eastern outskirts, he felt certain that the Russians would simply roll over the German positions. Too many defence necessities were missing. There were almost no mines available, so the belts of minefields that were essential to a defensive position hardly existed. One of the most ancient and effective of all defence items, barbed wire, had become almost impossible to obtain. Rehmann's artillery consisted of some mobile flak guns, a few tanks dug in up to the turrets so that their guns covered avenues of an approach, and the massive flak tower guns. Powerful as they were, these high-angled batteries had limited usefulness. Because of their fixed positions, they could not be deflected toward the ground to stave off close-range infantry and tank attacks. Rehmann knew his own situation was hopeless. He was almost equally pessimistic about the outlook elsewhere. He did not believe that the Oder front would hold, nor did he expect help from troops falling back on the city. Colonel Refior had discussed the possibility of obtaining aid with officers at General Buss's headquarters. He got a blunt answer. "Don't expect us," said Buss's chief of staff, Colonel Arthur Holtz. "The Ninth Army stays and will stay on the Oder. If necessary, we will fall there, but we will not retreat." Rehmann kept thinking of an exchange he'd had with a Volkssturm official in one sector. "What would you do right now?" Rehmann had asked, "if you suddenly saw Russian tanks in the far distance? How do you let us know? Let's assume that tanks are heading this way. Show me what you would do." To his amazement, the man turned abruptly and ran back to the village just behind the positions. A few minutes later he returned, breathless and dejected. "I couldn't get to the telephone," he explained sheepishly. "I forgot. The post office is closed between 1 and 2. As he headed back into the city, Raymond stared unseeing out the car window. He felt that an awful doom was gathering, and that in its blackness Berlin might disappear forever. The line was cracking slowly but surely under the massive enemy pressure. Heinrici had been at the front all day, going from headquarters to headquarters, visiting field positions, talking to commanders. He marvelled that Buss's soldiers had done so well against such terrible odds. First, the Ninth Army had stood off 3 days of heavy preliminary attacks. Now, for more than 24 hours, they had been taking the full force of the main Russian offensive. Buss's troops had fought back ferociously. In the Silo area alone, they had knocked out more than 150 tanks and had shot down 132 planes. But they were weakening. As he drove in darkness back to his headquarters, Heinrici found himself slowed by crowds of refugees. He had seen them everywhere this day, some carrying bundles, some pulling handcarts filled with their last possessions, some in farm wagons drawn by horses or oxen. In many places their numbers were posing almost as great a problem to Heinrici's troops as the Russians. At his command post, anxious staff officers gathered to hear the general's first-hand impression of the situation. Gravely, Heinrici summed up what he had seen. "They cannot last much longer," he said. "The men are so exhausted that their tongues are hanging out. Still," he continued, "we are holding. It is something Schorner couldn't do. That great soldier has not been able to hold Koniev even for 1 day." A short time later, the OKH chief, General Hans Krebs, rang up. "Well, we all have good reason to feel satisfied," he told Heinrici smoothly. Heinrici conceded the point. "Considering the size of the attack, we have not lost much ground," he said. Krebs would have preferred a more optimistic response, and he said as much, but Heinrici did not make it. "I have learned," he told Krebs dryly, "never to praise the day until the twilight comes." In the darkness, Private Willi Feldheim grasped his bulky Panzerfaust more firmly. He did not know for certain where he was, but he had heard that this line of foxholes covering the 3 roads in the Klosterdorf area was about 18 miles from the front. A little while ago, waiting for the Russian tanks to come up the road, Willi had felt a sense of great adventure. He had thought about what it would be like when he saw the first tank and could finally fire the anti-tank gun for the first time. The 3 companies holding the crossroads had been told to let the tanks get as close as possible before firing. Willi's instructor had said that a 60-yard range was about right. He wondered how soon they would come. Crouched in the damp foxhole, Willi thought about the days when he was a bugler. He remembered in particular one brilliant, sunshiny day in 1943, when Hitler spoke in Olympic Stadium and Willi had been among the massed buglers who had sounded the fanfare at the Führer's entrance. He would never forget the leader's words to the assembled Hitler youth. "You are the guarantee of the future," and the crowds had yelled, "Führer Befehl! Führer Befehl!" It had been the most memorable day of Willi's life. On that afternoon he had known beyond doubt that the Reich had the best army, the best weapons, the best generals, and above all the greatest leader in the world. The dream was gone in the sudden flash that illuminated the night sky. Willi peered out toward the front, and now he heard again the low rumbling of the guns he had momentarily forgotten, and he felt the cold. His stomach began to ache, and he wanted to cry. 15-year-old Willi Feldheim was badly scared, and all the noble aims and the stirring words could not help him now. The drumbeat was almost imperceptible. Softly the tubas answered. The muffled drum roll came again. Low and ominously the tubas replied. Then the massed basses came alive, and the awesome grandeur of Die Gotterdammerung rolled out from the Berlin Philharmonic. The mood in the darkness of Beethoven Hall seemed as tragic as the music. The only illumination came from the lights on the orchestra's music stands. It was cold in the hall, and people were wearing overcoats. Dr. von Westermann sat in a box with his wife and brother. Nearby was the sister of the conductor Robert Heger with 3 friends, and in his usual seat in the orchestra section was Reichsminister Albert Speer. Immediately after playing the Beethoven violin concerto, Taschner, his family, and the daughter of Georg de Bourtz had left the hall. They were now on their way to safety, but they were the only ones. Speer had kept his promise. His car was waiting. He had even sent his adjutant to escort the little group safely to their destination. Now the architect of Hitler's monstrous war-making industrial machine listened to the tempest of music as it told of the evil-doing of the gods, of Siegfried on his funeral bed of fire, of Brunhilde on horseback ascending the pyre to join him in death. Then, with cymbals crashing and drums rolling, the orchestra thundered to its climax, the terrible Holocaust that destroyed Valhalla. And as the mournful, majestic music filled the auditorium, those who listened felt a sorrow too deep for tears. Many soldiers joined the party on the Oder, for reasons which were not always political. Unlike American or British forces, the Red Army had no system of registration of identification discs or dog tags. Families of Red Army men killed or wounded in action were rarely officially informed. But if a communist soldier became a casualty, the party notified his family or next of kin. Zhukov told General Eisenhower and the press in June 1945 that he opened the attack with 22,000 guns of all calibers. His original plan called for 11,000 cannon, but whether he had acquired that many by the time of the attack is not known. While Russian accounts give a variety of figures, ranging from 20 to 40,000 guns, most military experts believe that Zhukov had at least 7,000 to 8,000 field pieces, and probably the same again in guns of lesser caliber. Konev was echoing Stalin's own suspicions. In early April, Stalin had cabled Roosevelt that an agreement had been reached at Berne with the Germans, whereby they would open the front to the Anglo-American troops and let them move east, while the British and Americans have promised in exchange to ease the armistice terms for the Germans. The Germans on the Western Front have in fact ceased the war. While they continue the war against Russia, the ally of Britain and the USA. Roosevelt answered that he was astonished at the allegation that I have entered into an agreement with the enemy without first obtaining your full agreement. Frankly, I cannot avoid a feeling of bitter resentment toward your informers, whoever they are, for such vile misrepresentations of my actions or those of my trusted subordinates. Stalin and his marshals remained unconvinced. Even today, the latest USSR Ministry of Defense history, the Great Fatherland War of the Soviet Union, 1941–45, says that, to avoid permitting the Red Army from seizing Berlin, the Hitlerites were prepared to surrender the capital to the Americans or to the English. Our allies also counted on seizing it, in spite of existing agreements, consigning Berlin to the operational zone of the Soviet Army. The fact is, of course, that no such agreement ever existed. Konev did not learn about the incident until 20 years later, when he read of it in General Pukov's memoirs. Vienna was captured by the Red Army on April 13th. Hitler was obviously referring to President Roosevelt. There are probably as many accounts of the last concert as there are survivors of the orchestra. Some tell one story, others another. There are differences of opinion about the date, the program, and even the performers. Those who knew nothing of Speer's plan refused to believe that any such scheme existed. The version which appears here is based on Dr. von Westermann's account and records, with subsidiary information from Gerhard Taschner. Almost nothing of the once mighty Third Reich remained. Crushed from both sides, on the map it resembled an hourglass. The North Sea and the Baltic formed the top, and Bavaria, parts of Czechoslovakia, Austria, and northern Italy, which Germany now occupied, made up the lower half. Across the narrow neck between these areas, only about 90 miles separated the Americans and the Russians. Fighting was still heavy in the north and, to a lesser degree, in the south. In the centre, General William Simpson's U.S. Ninth Army was simply holding its positions along the Elbe, mopping up pockets of resistance bypassed during the dash for the river and repulsing occasional sharp counterattacks against its bridgeheads. There was one sore spot for the 9th, Magdeburg. Again and again its commander had refused to surrender. Now Simpson had had enough. He called in bombers and levelled more than 1/3 of the city. Then he sent in his troops. On the afternoon of the 17th, as units of the 30th Infantry and 2nd Armoured Divisions began the attack, General Bradley joined Simpson at his headquarters. The phone rang. Simpson picked it up, listened for a moment, and then, putting his hand over the receiver, said to Bradley, "It looks as if we may get the bridge in Magdeburg after all. What'll we do then, Brad?" Bradley knew only too well what Simpson wanted him to say, that the Autobahn bridge was the most direct and fastest route to Berlin. But he shook his head. "Hell's bells," he replied. "We don't want any more bridgeheads on the Elbe. If you get it, you'll have to throw a battalion across it, I guess. But let's hope the other fellows blow it up before you're stuck with it." Bradley's instructions from Schaeff were clear. He could offer Simpson no hope of moving forward. The orders read, "Take the necessary action to avoid offensive action in force, including the formation of new bridgeheads east of the Elbe-Mulde line." Simpson's forces were to remain as a threat to Berlin, but that was all. Minutes later, a second call settled the issue. As he put down the phone, Simpson told Bradley, "No need to worry any longer. The Krauts just blew it up." The blowing of the bridge brought to an end the dream of Big Simp Simpson, who had wanted to take his mighty 9th Army into Berlin, the city which the Supreme Commander had once described as clearly the main prize. In the hamlets north of Boisenberg on the Elbe, the householders were startled by a distant wailing. The strange sound grew louder, and soon an astonishing apparition came in sight. Down the road tramped 2 Scottish bagpipers, their pipes skirling. Behind them came Warrant Officer Dixie Deans's POWs, 12,000 strong, marching in columns under a light German guard. The prisoners' uniforms were in tatters. Their few belongings were bundled and slung on their backs. They were emaciated, cold and hungry, but their heads were high. The determined Deans had seen to that. "When you pass through the villages," he told the men, "spruce up even if it hurts, and show these bloody supermen exactly who won this war." Dixie's own transport was an ancient bicycle that threatened to fall apart at any moment. A patch covered a large swelling on the front tyre. But bumpy as the ride was, Dixie was thankful for the mobility. He rode continuously from column to column, watching over his men and observing the German guards that marched on either side of each column. Every road was filled with POWs. There were nearly 2,000 to a column, and although Deans tried resolutely to cover the entire area, it was an exhausting job. After almost 10 days of seemingly aimless marching, Deans's men were in bad shape. There were a few German supply trucks in the procession, but for the most part the men were living off the countryside. The German commandant, Colonel Ostmann, appeared almost embarrassed by the meandering march and the shortage of food, but he told Deans, "There is just nothing I can do." Dixie believed him. "I don't think he has a clue from one day to the next where the devil we're going," Deans told fellow RAF Warrant Officer Ronald Mogg. The POWs had wandered like nomads since leaving Fallingbostel. Now they were heading for the town of Gresse, where trucks with Red Cross food parcels were said to await them. Deans hoped that they would halt there and go no farther. He told Ostmann that the march was useless, for the British would soon overrun them. Deans hoped he was right. From what the men were able to pick up on the precious secret radios they had carried out of the camp, the Allied news was good. Mogg, a shorthand expert, took down the BBC News twice a day. Whenever they could plug into an outlet, the radio in the gramophone was used. During the march, they relied on the battery-operated receiver. One of the German guards, Ostmann's interpreter, Corporal Charlie Gumbach, thought Sergeant John Bristow was foolish to carry the heavy, old-fashioned gramophone on his back. "Why don't you drop it somewhere?" the German suggested. "I've grown attached to it, Charlie," said Bristow seriously. "And anyway, the chaps would never forgive me if we didn't have music in the evenings." Bristow looked at the German suspiciously. "Don't you like to dance, Charlie?" he asked. Gumbach shrugged helplessly. All these British were madmen. As Deans's column swung down the road toward a new village, the pipers hoisted their instruments into position, and the tired men in the ranks squared their shoulders and got into step. "At least," said Ron Mogg, stepping out smartly alongside Deans on the bicycle, "we're impressing the natives no end." On the eastern front, Chuikov's guards and Katukov's tankers had finally gained a foothold on the Silo heights by sheer weight of numbers. A little before midnight on the 16th, General Popiel afterward remembered, the first 3 houses in the northern suburbs of the town of Silo had been captured. It was a bitter operation. All through the night of the 16th, Red Army attacks were smashed again and again by point-blank fire from anti-aircraft guns. "The Germans didn't even have to aim," Popiel said. "They just fired over open sights." Chuikov himself reached Silo about noon on the 17th. He found the resistance so fierce that he pessimistically estimated it would take 1 day to pierce each line of resistance between the Oder and Berlin. Not until the night of the 17th were the heights taken. It had indeed taken more than 48 hours to break through the first 2 lines. The Russians believed that there were at least 3 more such lines lying before Berlin. Popiel, trying to make his way to Katukov's headquarters some distance from Silo, saw that the fight had caused great confusion. Troops and tanks were everywhere, crammed into every corner, alley, street and garden. German artillery was still firing. In their effort to take the heights, Zhukov's troops had become disorganized. Now they had to be reassembled before moving again. Zhukov, furious and well aware of the pace Koniev was setting, demanded an all-out effort. During the fighting, Soviet tankers had come up with an ingenious solution to the bulky anti-tank rockets fired from Panzerfaust. To his amazement, General Yushchuk saw that his tankers had taken every bedspring they could find from German homes. These coiled wire contraptions were now hitched to the front of tanks to break the impact of the blunt-nosed rockets. Preceded by bedsprings, the Soviet cannon now prepared to lead the assault on the city. Near Cottbus, in a medieval castle overlooking the Spree, Marshal Koniev waited for his call to go through to Moscow. Somewhere, a lone enemy battery was still firing. It was typical German artillery fire, Koniev thought as he listened to the carefully timed, methodical bursting of the shells. He wondered what they were firing at, perhaps the castle or the antenna of his headquarters radio station. Whatever the target, the fire was not hindering his tanks, which had been crossing the Spree since noon. By now they were miles away, smashing through a disintegrating enemy and rumbling toward Lublin, near the point where the boundary between his army and Zhukov's ended. For Koniev, the time had come to call Stalin and ask permission to swing his tanks north toward Berlin. Koniev had every reason to be in high spirits. His tankers had moved with unforeseen speed, although the fighting had been brutally hard in some areas and casualties had been heavy. Earlier on this morning of the 17th, driving toward the front to watch the crossing of the Spree, Koniev had realized for the first time just how terrible the battle had been. His car had passed through smouldering forests and along fields cratered by artillery fire. There were, he recalled, huge quantities of decommissioned and burned-out tanks, equipment mired in streams and swamps, heaps of twisted metal, and there were dead everywhere, all that remained of the forces that had met and battled and passed through this land. Koniev had expected great difficulty crossing the Spree, which was 180 feet wide in places. By the time he reached the headquarters of General Rybalko's Third Guards Tank Army, a few tanks had actually been ferried across, but ferrying was much too slow. The Spree line had to be forced fast. Koniev and Rybalko hurried to an area where reconnaissance patrols had reported evidence that some sort of ford existed. Although the river at this site was close to 150 feet wide, Koniev, after inspecting the terrain, decided to risk sending a tank on a trial crossing. Rybalko selected the best tank crew in his lead detachment and explained what they were to attempt. The tank plunged in. Under fire from the west bank, it began slowly to move across. the water rose up over its treads, but it got no deeper. At this one point, the river was only 3.5 feet deep. One behind another, Rybalko's tanks lumbered through the water. The German line on the Spree was cracked. Koniev's forces moved across the river in strength and charged ahead at full speed. Now, in the Cottbus castle, the marshal's call to Moscow came through. An aide handed Koniev the radio telephone. As he spoke, he reverted to the military formality that Stalin always demanded. "This is the commander of the First Ukrainian Front," he said. Stalin replied, "Comrade Stalin, go ahead." "This is my tactical situation," Koniev reported. "My armoured forces are now 23 kilometres, about 14 miles northwest of Finsterwalde, and my infantry are on the banks of the Spree." He paused. "I suggest that my armoured formations move immediately in a northerly direction." He carefully avoided mentioning Berlin. "Zhukov," Stalin said, "is having a difficult time. He is still breaking through the defences on the Silo Heights. Enemy resistance there appears stiff and unyielding." There was a brief pause. Then Stalin said, "Why not pass Zhukov's armour through the gap created on your front and let him go for Berlin from there? Is that possible?" "Comrade Stalin," Koniev said quickly, "it would take much time and cause great confusion. There is no necessity for transferring armour from the First Belarusian Front. Operations in my section are going favourably." He took the plunge. "I have adequate forces, and we are in a perfect position to turn our tank armies toward Berlin." Koniev explained that he could send his forces toward the city by way of Zossen, 25 miles south of Berlin. "What scale map are you using?" Stalin asked suddenly. 1 to 200,000, Koniev answered. Dot. There was a pause while Stalin referred to his own map. Then he said, "Are you aware that Zossen is the headquarters of the German General Staff?" Koniev said he was Dot. There was another pause. Finally, Stalin said, "Very well, I agree. Turn your tank armies toward Berlin." The Generalissimo added that he would issue new army boundary lines, and then, abruptly, he hung up. Koniev put down his own phone, immensely satisfied. Zhukov learned of Koniev's drive on Berlin from Stalin himself, and for the general it apparently was not a pleasant conversation. What was said no one knew, but the headquarters staff could see its effect on the commander. As Lieutenant Colonel Pavel Troyanovsky, senior correspondent for the military paper Red Star, was later to recall the incident. The attack had stalled, and Stalin reprimanded Zhukov. It was a serious situation, and a reprimand from Stalin was often couched in not very mild language. Troyanovsky could plainly see that Zhukov, a man with all the marks of an iron will about his face, and a man who did not like to share his glory with anyone, was extremely worked up. General Popiel described Zhukov's state of mind more succinctly. "We have a lion on our hands," he told his fellow staff members. The lion was not long in showing his claws. That evening the word went out from a grim Zhukov to the entire 1st Belarusian Army Group. "Now take Berlin!" By now, confusion was beginning to sweep the German lines. Shortages were apparent everywhere and in everything. A critical lack of transport, an almost total absence of fuel, and roads thronged with refugees made large-scale troop movements almost impossible. This immobility was producing dire consequences. As units shifted position, their equipment, including precious artillery, had to be abandoned. Communication networks were faltering and, in some places, no longer existed. As a result, orders were often obsolete when they reached their destinations, or even when they were issued. The chaos was compounded as officers arriving at the front to take over units discovered nothing to take over, because their commands had already been captured or annihilated. In some areas, inexperienced men, left leaderless, did not know exactly where they were or who was fighting on their flanks. Even in veteran outfits, headquarters were forced to move with such frequency that often the troops did not know where their command post was or how to contact it. Units were trapped and captured or simply overrun and slaughtered. Others, demoralized, broke and ran. In only 2 places did the Vistula front remain intact. The northern area held by General Hasso von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army had not been hit by Zhukov's massive assault, but von Manteuffel was expecting an attack at any moment by Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusians. Farther south, part of Busse's 9th Army was still holding, but it was beginning to be affected by the general disintegration. Its left flank had already started to crumble before Zhukov's avalanche of tanks. The right was halfway encircled by Koniev's sledgehammer drive south of Berlin. In truth, the army group Vistula was breaking up piece by piece, in chaos, confusion, and death, exactly as Heinrichi had known it would. Von Manteuffel, like Heinrichi, had never underestimated the Russians. He too had fought them many times before. Now, in his Storch reconnaissance plane over the Oder, he studied the enemy. Rokossovsky's men were making no effort to hide their assault preparations. Artillery and infantry units were being openly moved up into position. Von Manteuffel marvelled at the Russians' cockiness. For days now, as he flew back and forth over their lines, they had not even bothered to look up. Von Manteuffel knew that when the drive came he would not be able to hold for very long. He was a panzer general without panzers. To halt Zhukov's drive in the 9th Army sector, Heinrichi had denuded von Manteuffel's army of the few panzer divisions it had left. They had come from the 3rd SS Corps, holding the southern edge of his sector in the forests of Eberswalde. SS General Felix Steiner, who was regarded by Wehrmacht officers as one of the best of the SS generals, reported that though he had lost the tanks, he had been given other reinforcements. Solemnly he reported to von Manteuffel, "I have just received 5,000 Luftwaffe pilots, each with his little iron cross hanging around his neck. Tell me, what do I do with them?" "I have no doubt," von Manteuffel told his staff, "that on Hitler's maps there is a little flag saying 7th Panzer Div Corps, even though it got here without a single tank, truck, piece of artillery, or even a machine gun. We have an army of ghosts." Now, looking down on the Russians' preparations from his plane, von Manteuffel figured that he could expect their main assault sometime around the 20th. He knew exactly what he was going to do then. He would hold as long as possible, and then he intended to retreat step by step, with my soldiers arm to arm, shoulder to shoulder, all the way to the west. Von Manteuffel had no intention of allowing even one of them to fall into Russian hands. The situation of the 9th Army was now bordering on the catastrophic, yet its commander was not considering pulling back. To General Theodor Busse, retreat, except under orders, was comparable to treason, and Hitler's orders were to stand fast. Zhukov's tanks, storming on after their breakthrough on Silo Heights, had ripped a gash in the army's northern flank, and now the 1st Belarusians were charging at breakneck speed toward Berlin. The near absence of communications made it impossible for Busse to assess the extent of the breakthrough. He did not even know if counterattacks could close the tear in his lines. His best information was that Zhukov's tanks were already within 25 miles of Berlin's outskirts. Even more alarming was Koniev's blistering drive along the 9th southern flank. The 1st Ukrainians, now beyond Lublin, were arching back behind the 9th and racing northward for the city. Would the 9th be cut off, Busse wondered, just as Model's army group had been in the Ruhr? Model had been lucky in one respect. He had been encircled by the Americans. The situation was particularly galling for General Karl Weidling, whose 56th Panzer Corps had absorbed the full brunt of Zhukov's breakthrough on the Silo Heights. His corps had held off Zhukov for 48 hours, inflicting staggering casualties. But the promised reserve divisions that Weidling so anxiously awaited, the SS Nordland Division and the powerful, fully operational 18th Panzer Grenadier Division, had not arrived in time for the counterattacks that might have stopped Zhukov's tanks. One man from the Nordland Division did show up, the commander, SS Major General Jürgen Ziegler. Arriving by car at Weidling's headquarters north of Müncheberg, Ziegler announced calmly that his division was miles away. It had run out of fuel. Weidling was livid. Every panzer division carried reserves for just such emergencies. But Ziegler, who disliked fighting under Wehrmacht officers, apparently did not consider his division's arrival urgent. Now, 20 precious hours had been lost in refuelling, and Ziegler was still not in position. The 18th Panzer Grenadier Division, which should have reached Weidling the day before, on the 17th, had just arrived. The counter-attacks that had been planned for this force would not take place. The division had arrived just in time to retreat. Weidling seemed dogged by bad luck. When Zhukov's massive columns of tanks surged out from the plateau, among the German units hit hardest had been the one force that Heinrici had worried about most, Goering's 9th Parachute Division. Already demoralized by their initial exposure to the battle on the heights, Goering's paratroopers panicked and broke as the Russian tanks, guns blazing, smashed into their lines. Colonel Hans-Oskar Wöhlemann, Weidling's new artillery commander, who had arrived on the opening day of the Russian offensive across the Oder, witnessed the rout that followed. Everywhere, he said, were soldiers running away like madmen. Even when he drew his pistol, the frantic paratroopers did not halt. Wöhlemann found the division's commander utterly alone and completely disheartened by the flight of his men, trying to hold back whatever there was left to hold back. Eventually, the headlong flight was stopped, but Goering's much-vaunted paratroopers remained, in Wöhlemann's words, a threat to the course of the whole battle. As for Heinrici, when he heard the news, he rang Goering at Karin Hall. "I have something to tell you," he said acidly. "Those casino troops of yours, those famous paratroopers, well, they have run away." Although Weidling tried desperately to stem the Russian armoured assaults, the 56th Corps front could not hold. Weidling's chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel Theodor von Duffing, saw that the Russians were beginning to force us back by applying terrific pressure in a kind of horseshoe-like manoeuvre, hitting us from both sides and encircling us again and again. The Corps was also subjected to merciless air attacks. Von Duffing had to take cover 30 times within 4 hours. The Soviet pincer tactics had forced Weidling to evacuate 2 headquarters since noon. As a result, he had lost communications with Buss's headquarters. At nightfall, Weidling found himself in a candle-lit cellar at Waldseversdorf, northwest of Müncheberg. There he received a visitor, Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, looking shaky and apprehensive. He kept looking at us expectantly, Wöhlemann was to remember, with anxious, sad eyes. When he heard the truth about the 56th Corps situation, it seemed to have a crushing effect upon him. Hesitantly, the Foreign Minister asked a few questions in a hoarse, quiet voice, and shortly thereafter he took his leave. Wöhlemann and other members of the headquarters staff had half expected von Ribbentrop to tell us that negotiations had begun from our side with the English and the Americans. It would have given us hope at this last hour. He left no such word. On the heels of the Foreign Minister arrived the one-armed 32-year-old leader of the Hitler Youth, Arthur Axmann. He brought news he was sure would please Weidling. The youngsters of the Hitler Youth, Axmann announced, were ready to fight, and were even now manning the roads in the 56th Corps rear. Weidling's reaction to the news was not what Axmann had expected. As Wöhlemann remembers, Weidling was so enraged that for a moment he was almost inarticulate. Then, using extremely coarse language, he denounced Axmann's plan. "You cannot sacrifice these children for a cause that is already lost," he angrily told the youth leader. "I will not use them, and I demand that the order sending these children into battle be rescinded." The pudgy Axmann hurriedly gave Weidling his word that the order would be countermanded. If such a directive was issued, it never reached hundreds of Hitler Youth boys lying under arms on the approaches to the city. They remained in position. In the next 48 hours, they were steamrolled by Russian attacks. Willy Feldheim and the 130 boys in his company were swamped. They fell back helter-skelter and finally stopped and tried to hold a line in the protection of some ditches and a bunker. At last, Willy, exhausted by fear, stretched out on a bench during a lull in the fighting and fell asleep. Hours later, he woke up with a strange sense that something was wrong. A voice said, "I wonder what's up. It's so silent." The boys rushed out of the bunker and were confronted by a fantastic, incredible scene, like an old painting of the Napoleonic Wars. The sun was shining, and there were bodies everywhere. Nothing was standing. Houses were in ruins. There were cars wrecked and abandoned, some of them still burning. The worst shock was the dead. They were heaped in piles, in a weird tableau, with their rifles and Panzerfauster lying beside them. It was lunatic. And then we realized that we were all alone. They had slept through the entire attack. In Berlin, the tension was building hour by hour. General Reymann's scanty forces, manning the outer perimeter rings, had been warned that the signal Clausewitz, code name for the attack on the city, might come at any time. Various emergency measures had gone into effect, making clear to all Berliners that the moment of truth was at hand. Among other things, along the main roads and thoroughfares, the closing of the barricades had begun. Not even Goebbels could ignore the threat any longer. A torrent of hysterical news and slogans poured out of the propaganda ministry. The official Nazi Party newspaper, Völkischer Beobachter, announced the Soviet drive across the Oder and said, "A new and heavy trial, perhaps the heaviest of all, is before us." The newspaper continued, "Each square metre of territory which the enemy has to battle for, each Soviet tank which a grenadier, a Volkssturm man, or a Hitler lad destroys bears more weight today than at any other time in this war. The word for the day is, clench your teeth, fight like the devil, don't give up 1 foot of soil easily. The hour of decision demands the last, the greatest effort." Berliners were warned that the Russians had already decided the fate of the city's inhabitants. Those who were not killed at the barricades, Goebbels warned, would be liquidated by deportation as slave labour. On the afternoon of the 18th, General Reymann received an order from the Reichskanzlei, later confirmed by a personal call from Goebbels, that all forces available, including Volkssturm, have been requested by the Ninth Army to hold second-line positions. In other words, the city was to be stripped to man the outer defences. Reymann was astounded. Hurriedly, 10 Volkssturm battalions were rounded up, along with a regiment of anti-aircraft defence units of the Great Germany Guard Regiment. After hours of search and requisition, a miscellaneous collection of vehicles was assembled, and the force headed east. As he watched them go, Reymann turned to Goebbels' deputy. "Tell Goebbels," he said angrily, "that it is no longer possible to defend the Reich capital. The inhabitants are defenceless." Karl Weiberg's face betrayed no emotion, but he noticed that his hands were trembling. After the long months of his quest, he could hardly believe his ears. Standing among other customers near the main counter of the black market food store, he leaned down and patted his little dachshunds. The action also enabled him to hear a little better, although the 2 well-dressed women standing next to him had made no attempt at secrecy. Most Berliners knew nothing about this well-stocked shop. It sold only to selected customers, including those well up in Nazi echelons. Weiberg had been patronizing the place for a long time, and he had picked up many choice and accurate items of information just by listening to such customers as these 2 well-fed ladies. Their information ought to be accurate, he thought. Their husbands were both important Nazis. Weiberg decided he had heard enough. He collected his purchases, doffed his Homburg to the proprietor, and strolled out of the store. In the street, his pace quickened as he hurried to find Jessenschmidt. Several hours later, after a lengthy discussion, both men agreed that Weiberg's news had to be true. By the afternoon of Wednesday, April 18th, a message was en route to London. Though all their other hopes had been dashed, Weiberg fervently hoped the Allies would act on this report. According to what he had overheard in the food shop, Hitler was definitely in the Berlin area, at a headquarters in Bernau, only about 14 miles northeast of the city. What better present could they give him for his 56th birthday, April 20th, than a massive air raid? General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations, returned home at 3 a.m. on April 20th. His face was lined with worry and exhaustion. The crisis had been reached, he told his wife Louise. "You'd better start packing and get ready to leave," he said. Louise argued. She wanted to continue with her Red Cross work. But Jodl was insistent. "With your name, the Russians would not wait a single day before shipping you off to Lubyanka," he said. "Where were they going?" she asked. Jodl shrugged. To the north or south, nobody knows, he said, but I hope we can face the end together. They talked most of the night. A little before 10 a.m. the sirens sounded. I'll bet Berlin gets an extra ration of bombs today, Jodl said. It always happens on Hitler's birthday. Jodl hurried upstairs to shave before going back to the Führer bunker. This birthday was to be no different from the Führer's others. There would be the usual parade of government officials and cabinet members arriving to congratulate Hitler, and Jodl was expected to be present. As he came down the stairs, Louise handed him his cap and belt. He picked up his map case and kissed her goodbye. I must hurry for the congratulations, he said. Louise wondered, as she did every day now, whether they would ever see each other again. Bless you, she called after her husband as he got into his car. Another of Hitler's court was also ready to leave for the ceremonies. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring intended to show up just to prove he was still loyal, but from there he was heading south. Göring had decided that the moment had come for him to bid farewell to his huge castle and estate at Karinhall, about 50 miles northwest of Berlin. He had reached the decision shortly after the Soviet bombardment began at 5:30 a.m. Göring had promptly called Heinrich's headquarters in nearby Prenzlau. The attack in the north had begun, he was told. Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusians had finally launched their offensive against von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army. Göring was well aware that von Manteuffel's strength was inadequate. The Reichsmarschall had toured that front several times in the previous weeks, loudly telling one general after another that because of all the loafing around, nothing is prepared. The Russians will just laugh their way through your lines. Göring himself had prepared well for this moment. Lined up on the main road outside the gates of his estate were 24 Luftwaffe trucks loaded with the contents of Karinhall, his antiques, paintings, silver and furniture. This convoy was to head south immediately. Most of the Luftwaffe headquarters people in Berlin, along with their equipment, were to leave in other convoys later in the day. Now, standing by the main gates, Göring spoke a few final words to the commander of the truck column. Surrounded by motorcyclists, it moved off. Göring stood looking at the huge castle with its magnificent wings and buttresses. A Luftwaffe engineering officer came up. Everything, he said, was ready. As a few of his men and some of the local villagers watched, Göring walked across the road, bent over a detonator, and pushed down the plunger. With a tremendous roar, Karinhall blew up. Without waiting for the dust to settle, Göring walked back to his car. Turning to one of his engineering officers, he said calmly, "Well, that's what you have to do sometimes when you're a crown prince." Slamming the car door, he set out for Berlin and the Führer's birthday celebration. Hitler rose at 11 a.m., and from noon on he received the tributes of his inner clique, among them Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Albert Speer, and his military leaders Karl Dönitz, Wilhelm Keitel, Alfred Jodl, Hans Krebs, and Heinrich Himmler. After them came Berlin area Gauleiters, staff members, and secretaries. Then, as the guns rumbled in the distance, Hitler, followed by his entourage, emerged from the bunker. There, in the bombed wilderness of the Reichskanzlei gardens, he inspected men from 2 units, the SS Frundsberg Division, a recently arrived unit from the Kurland Army, and a proud little group from Axmann's Hitler Youth. Everyone, Axmann said long afterward, was shocked at the Führer's appearance. He walked with a stoop, his hands trembled, but it was surprising how much willpower and determination still radiated from this man. Hitler shook hands with the boys and decorated some whom Axmann introduced as having recently distinguished themselves at the front. Then Hitler walked down the line of SS men. He shook hands with each one and confidently predicted that the enemy would be defeated before the approaches to Berlin. Looking on was Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. Since April 6th, he had been meeting secretly from time to time with Count Volker Bernadotte, head of the Swedish Red Cross. In a vague way, Himmler had sounded out Bernadotte about the possibility of negotiating peace terms with the Allies, But now he stepped forward and reaffirmed his loyalty and that of the SS to Hitler. In a few hours he was scheduled to meet once more with Bernadotte. Immediately after the inspection ceremonies, Hitler's military conference began. By this time, Goering had arrived. General Krebs conducted the briefing, although everyone was familiar with the situation. Berlin would be encircled within a matter of days, if not hours. Even before that happened, Busse's Ninth Army would be surrounded and trapped unless orders for its withdrawal were given. To Hitler's military advisers, one point was clear. The Führer and vital government ministries and departments still in Berlin must leave the capital for the south. Keitel and Jodl particularly urged the move, but Hitler refused to acknowledge that things were that serious. According to Colonel Nikolaus von Below, the Führer's Luftwaffe adjutant, Hitler stated that the battle for Berlin presented the only chance to prevent total defeat. He did make one concession. In the event that the Americans and Russians linked up on the Elbe, the Reich would be commanded in the north by Admiral Dönitz and in the south possibly by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. Meanwhile, various government agencies were given authorization to leave immediately. Hitler did not reveal his own plans, but at least 3 people in the bunker were convinced he would never leave Berlin. Fräulein Johanna Wulff, one of Hitler's secretaries, had heard him remark only a few days earlier that he would take his own life if he felt the situation was beyond saving. Von Below, too, believed that Hitler had made up his mind to stay in Berlin and die there. Jodl, when he returned home, told his wife that Hitler in a private talk had said, "Jodl, I shall fight as long as the faithful fight next to me, and then I shall shoot myself." Most of the government had already left Berlin, but the remaining Reich administrative agencies almost seemed to have been preparing for this moment for days, like runners awaiting a starter's pistol. The real exodus now began. It was to continue until the city was finally surrounded. The Luftwaffe's Chief of Staff, General Karl Kohler, noted in his diary that Goering had departed. "Naturally," Kohler wrote, "he leaves me here to let all Hitler's anger pass over me." Bureaucrats big and small made their getaway. Philippe Humbert, a young French forced labourer who worked as a draftsman in the offices of Dr. Karl Dustmann, one of the Todt labour organisation architects, was dumbfounded when his boss suddenly gave him a present of 1,000 marks, about $250, and then left town. Margareta Schwarz, in the garden of her apartment house in Charlottenburg, glanced down the street and saw a large chauffeur-driven blue car pull up outside a nearby house. Her neighbour, Otto Soliman, joined her, and together they watched as an orderly in a neat white jacket, along with a naval officer with lots of gold on his uniform, left the house. Quickly the car was packed with baggage. Then the men jumped in and drove off at top speed. Soliman said to Margareta, "The rats are leaving the sinking ship. That was Admiral Raeder." In all, the Berlin Commandant's office issued over 2,000 permits to leave the capital. There was something almost comic about the reasons with which state and party functionaries backed up their requests to leave the city, the Chief of Staff, Colonel Hans Refior, later recalled. Even though Goebbels had ordered that no man capable of carrying arms is to leave Berlin, we put no difficulties in the way of these home fighters who wanted passes. Why should we hold up these contemptible characters? They all believed that flight would save their precious lives. The majority of the population remained behind. Flight for them was beyond their means anyway, because of the transport shortage. In the dental offices at 213 Kurfürstendamm, blonde Katha Häusermann got a phone call from her employer. The Nazis' top dentist, Professor Hugo J. Blaschke, was leaving immediately. A few days earlier, Blaschke had instructed Käthe to pack all dental records, X-rays, moulds, and other equipment in boxes so they could be collected and sent south. Blaschke said that he expected the Chancellery group to leave any day and we are going with them. Käthe had told him she was staying in Berlin. Blaschke was furious. "Do you realize what it's going to be like when the Russians get here?" he asked. "First you'll be raped, then you'll be strung up. Have you any idea what the Russians are like?" But Käthe just could not believe it was going to be that bad. Later she was to recall, "I didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. Maybe it was foolishness, but I was so busy that I didn't realize how desperate everything had become." Now Blaschka was insistent. "Pack up and get out," he urged. "The Chancellery group and their families are leaving." But Kata was adamant. She intended to stay in the city. "Well," Blaschka said, "remember what I told you." Then he hung up. Suddenly, Kat remembered something Blaschka had asked her to do some days before. If he left the city and she remained, she was to warn a certain friend of his, using a code sentence because, said Blaschka, the phones might be tapped, that the top Nazis were fleeing. If the entire entourage had gone, she was to say, "The bridge was removed last night." If only some had departed, the sentence was to be, "Only a tooth was extracted last night." She had no idea who Blaschka's friend was, except that his name was Professor Galwitz or Grauwitz, and I think he mentioned that he was a senior dentist for the SS. Blaschka had given her only a telephone number. Now, under the impression that the entire Chancellery group had left, she called the number. When a man spoke, Kata said, "The bridge was removed last night." A few hours later that evening, Professor Ernst Grauwitz, head of the German Red Cross and friend of Heinrich Himmler, sat down to dinner with his family. When everyone was seated, Grauwitz reached down, pulled the pins on 2 hand grenades, and blew himself and his family to oblivion. The great exodus would always be remembered by the Berliners as the flight of the golden pheasants. But most people that day were more aware of advancing Russians than of fleeing Nazis. Helena Boese, wife of film director Karl Boese, recalled that the only concern now was to somehow stay alive. Soviet troops were already at Müncheberg and Strausberg, about 15 miles to the east, and now the news was filtering through the city that another Russian drive was heading toward the capital from the south, toward Zossen. Georg Schröter, a screenwriter living in Tempelhof, learned of this Russian advance firsthand. Worried about a girlfriend of his, a cabaret artist named Trude Berliner who lived in one of the outlying districts south of Berlin, Schröter phoned her home. She answered and then said, "Wait a minute." There was a pause. "I have someone here who would like to speak to you," she said. Schröter found himself conversing with a Soviet colonel who spoke perfect German. "You can count on us," he told the astonished Schröter, "to be there in 2 or 3 days." Everywhere, north, south, and east, the fronts were shrinking. And now almost all the machinery of the shattered, ruined metropolis was either slowing down or coming to a halt. Factories were closing, streetcars had ceased to run, the subway had stopped except for the transport of essential workers. Ilse Koenig, a laboratory technician in the city health department, remembers the Roter Ausweis, red pass, she received in order to continue riding to her job. Garbage was no longer being collected, mail could not be delivered. Gertrude Evers, working in the main post office on Oranienburger Strasse, remembered the terrific stench of spoiled, undelivered food packages that hung over the building. Because most of the police were now either in fighting units or the Volkssturm, the streets were no longer patrolled. For many people on this 20th of April, the seriousness of the situation was really brought home by a single occurrence. The zoo closed its gates. Electricity there stopped at exactly 10:50 a.m., making it impossible to pump in water. The current would come on again 4 days later, but for only 19 minutes. Thereafter it would remain off until the battle was over. But from this day onward, the keepers knew that many of the animals must surely die, particularly the hippos in the pools and the inhabitants of the aquarium that had been saved earlier. Heinrich Schwarz, the bird-keeper, already worried about the condition of the rare Abu Markub stork, which was slowly but surely starving to death in the Schwarz bedroom, now wondered how the bird could possibly survive without water. He would carry pails of water until he collapsed, the 63-year-old Schwarz decided, and not only for Abu, but for Rosa, the big hippo, and her 2-year-old baby, Kanauchka. Zoo director Lutz Heck was in a quandary. He knew that eventually the dangerous animals must be destroyed. in particular the zoo's prize baboon, but he kept putting off the moment. Distraught and in need of a moment's peace, Heck did something he had never before done in his life. He went fishing in the Landwehr Canal along with one of the keepers. There, while thinking things out, the men caught 2 pike. That day Fritz Kraft, the municipal subway director, met with Berlin's mayor, Julius Lippert. The mayor gave Kraft and the assembled subway managers some realistic instructions. "If the Western Allies get here first," Lippert told the group, "hand over the subway installations intact. If the Russians get here before them—" He paused, shrugged and said, "Destroy as much as possible." Small automatic telephone exchanges got similar instructions. Mechanics at the Buckow exchange were told to destroy the installations rather than let the Russians capture them. But maintenance man Herbert Magda suddenly realized that nobody had been given any instructions about how to do it. To the best of Magda's knowledge, not a single exchange was destroyed. Nearly all of them continued to work throughout the battle. Factories also were ordered levelled, in keeping with Hitler's scorched earth policy. Professor Georg Henneberg, head of the Sharing Chemical Department in Charlottenburg, remembers the plant director calling in all the chemists and reading an order he had just received. As the enemy got closer, the edict said water, gas, electrical and boiler installations were to be destroyed. Henneberg's boss finished reading the order, paused a moment, then said, "Now, gentlemen, you know what you are not supposed to do." He bid them all goodbye and closed down the plant intact. As Henneberg remembers, "We all bid farewell to one another until life after death." For years, Berliners would remember that April 20th for still another reason. Whether in celebration of the Führer's birthday or in anticipation of the climax to come, no one knew. But that day, the government gave the hungry populace extra allocations of food called crisis rations. As Jürgen Erich Klotz, a 25-year-old one-armed veteran, remembered, the extra food allocation consisted of 1 pound of bacon or sausage, 1/2 pound of rice or oatmeal, 250 dried lentils, peas or beans, 1 can of vegetables, 2 pounds of sugar, about 1 ounce of coffee, a small package of a coffee substitute, and some fats. Although there were almost 5 hours of air raids on Berlin this day, housewives braved the bombs to pick up the extra rations. They were to last 8 days, and, as Anneliese Beyer said to her husband, "With these rations we shall now ascend into heaven." The same thought apparently occurred to Berliners everywhere. The extra food came to be known as Himmelfahrtsrationen, Ascension Day rations. At Gresse, north of the Elbe, the Red Cross packages had arrived for Warrant Officer Dixie Deans's 12,000 POWs. Deans had made all the arrangements. He had even persuaded the commandant, Colonel Ostmann, to let RAF men go to the International Red Cross Centre in Lübeck and drive trucks back to get delivery faster.